Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in all of our lives when we're faced with a quiet but powerful decision to keep repeating a cycle that drains us, or to choose a different kind of strength. Not the kind that shouts, not the kind that fights, but the kind that walks away with grace, the kind that says, "This no longer feels like love, it feels like survival." Some of the strongest people you'll ever meet aren't the ones who stay and endure chaos. They're the ones who choose peace even when their heart is still invested, even when the pattern feels familiar, even when breaking it means being alone for a while. Tonight, I want to talk to you about that moment. The moment you stop trying to fix what keeps breaking you and start choosing yourself instead. Empaths have an extraordinary emotional capacity. They listen when no one else does, feel what others try to hide, and offer compassion where others show judgment. Their hearts are open, soft, and often vulnerable. They see potential in people, even when that potential is buried beneath fear, dysfunction, or emotional unavailability. They carry not only their own emotions, but also the emotions of others, like a sponge absorbing the hurt, the silence, the disconnection, and they give, sometimes endlessly, believing that their love can heal even the most guarded soul. In relationships, especially with avoidant partners, empaths tend to overfunction. They adapt, they accommodate, they excuse, they rationalize the distance and tell themselves stories like they've been hurt before or they just need time. They lean in when the other leans away. They speak when the other retreats. They stay even when the connection begins to erode because they hope. Hope is not a fleeting emotion for an empath. It is a commitment. They believe in the people they love, often more than those people believe in themselves. But even the most loving heart has a threshold. There's a moment, a very quiet, deeply internal moment, where something inside the empath shifts. It's not announced. It doesn't come with yelling or slamming doors. It arrives like a whisper after nights of overthinking and conversations that feel like they go in circles. It's the moment they realize they've been trying alone. They've been giving without receiving. They've been emotionally starving while pretending to be emotionally full. And in that moment, their love does not disappear, but it changes shape. The empath begins to reclaim their energy, not in rebellion, but in realization. They start pulling their attention inward after spending so long pouring it outward. They stop initiating conversations. They stop trying to decode silence. They stop justifying behavior that never grows. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about recognizing that they have betrayed themselves in the name of connection. They thought they were being loving, but they were being drained. And as this shift unfolds, something even more powerful happens. The empath stops waiting for the call, the text, the apology, the change. They no longer check their phone hoping for acknowledgement. They no longer plan their words hoping to avoid conflict. They no longer suppress their needs to keep the peace. Because they've realized that peace at the cost of their own emotional well-being isn't peace at all, it's performance. This turning point is often misunderstood. Outsiders may see it as cold or sudden. The avoidant may interpret it as you changed, but what really happened is the empath returned to themselves. They stopped holding space for someone who continually left the room. They stopped trying to prove their worth to someone who couldn't receive it. And in doing so, they stepped out of the emotional loop that kept them stuck. The truth is, empaths are not limitless. Their patience can wear thin. Their giving can reach exhaustion, and when they are finally done, truly done, it's not a performance. It's not a manipulation, it's final. They will walk away with grace, but with clarity, and that kind of quiet departure leaves the loudest echo. They are not being unkind, they are being honest. They are not abandoning the other person, they are rescuing themselves. Because somewhere along the line, they realize that their capacity to love others cannot come at the expense of loving themselves. Empaths feel everything, but they eventually feel enough to know they deserve better. That realization does not make them hard, it makes them whole. Silence has a language of its own. It speaks when words no longer serve their purpose. It arrives not with anger, but with clarity. For the empath, who has spent so much time communicating, explaining, reassuring, and trying to be understood, silence is never the first choice. It's the last resort, the final page of a chapter that's been read too many times. When an empath becomes silent, it's not because they have nothing left to say, but because they've already said everything, again and again, and nothing has changed. In relationships, especially with emotionally distant or avoidant partners, the empath is the one who constantly tries to bridge the gap. They reach out even when they're tired. They initiate conversations even after being dismissed. They ask the hard questions, hoping the other person will finally meet them halfway. They forgive easily. They give benefit of the doubt. They hold on, believing that love, patience, and effort will be enough to bring closeness. But every unanswered message, every dismissive reaction, every moment of withdrawal chips away at that hope. And while the empath may stay physically present, emotionally they begin to retreat. It starts subtly. Less texting, shorter responses, fewer questions, not because they don't care anymore, but because they're starting to understand that care alone cannot carry a relationship. They begin to see the one-sidedness. They begin to feel the emotional labor they've been doing, and it starts to weigh heavily. That's when silence begins to grow. It is not the loud silence of resentment or manipulation. It is the quiet silence of recognition. The empath is realizing that the effort they give is not being matched, that their voice is echoing in an empty room, that the emotional connection they crave cannot be created alone. Silence is not just the absence of noise. It is the presence of emotional exhaustion. And this silence is terrifying, not for the empath, but for the avoidant, because the avoidant has grown used to the empath's words, to their emotional leadership, to their comfort, to their consistent presence. The empath's efforts were the glue that held things together. When that glue is gone, everything begins to unravel. The avoidant often misinterprets this silence as detachment or disinterest. But in reality, it's not that the empath stopped caring, it's that they stopped sacrificing themselves. They've realized that explaining themselves to someone unwilling to listen is a form of self-neglect. They've realized that constantly trying to fix what's broken alone is not noble, it's draining. The silence grows stronger as the empath starts focusing inward. They begin to nurture their own needs. They rediscover the parts of themselves that were dimmed while they were trying to be enough for someone else. They stop trying to be understood by someone who never truly tried to understand them. And in that quiet space, they find something they've been missing for a long time: peace. Meanwhile, the avoidant begins to feel the discomfort of that silence. The absence of the empath's presence creates an emotional vacuum. There are no more messages to ignore, no more attempts to decode, no more emotional safety net. That silence, once mistaken as distance, now reveals itself as loss. The avoidant starts to notice what's missing, not because the empath made a dramatic exit, but because they disappeared without a sound. This is where the shift happens, because silence is not passive. It is an active, deliberate choice. It is the decision to stop begging for connection, to stop pleading for emotional crumbs, and to start choosing self-respect. It is not about revenge, it's about liberation. The empath's silence is not the absence of love, it's the presence of boundaries. It is the quiet confirmation that they will no longer chase someone who keeps running. It is the recognition that true intimacy cannot exist without reciprocity. And once the empath embraces that silence, they become unreachable to the version of the person who only knew how to take them for granted. This silence isn't empty. It's full of lessons, clarity, and strength. It's the sound of an empath finally hearing themselves after trying so long to be heard. Avoidants aren't necessarily heartless. They're not immune to love. In fact, many of them feel it deeply, but process it differently. Where some lean into intimacy, avoidants instinctively pull away, not because they don't care, but because closeness triggers discomfort. Vulnerability feels threatening, dependence feels suffocating, and emotional availability feels unsafe. So they retreat, not always physically, but emotionally. They create distance, avoid difficult conversations, and often leave the other person confused and hurt. For the empath, this creates a confusing experience. They give more, love harder, wait longer, hoping that the avoidant will eventually feel safe enough to meet them in the middle. But what often goes unnoticed is that the avoidant isn't afraid of love itself. They are afraid of losing control within love. Love, for them, can feel like surrender, and surrender in their world feels like danger. Avoidants often equate closeness with a loss of autonomy. The deeper the bond becomes, the more exposed they feel. And exposure triggers fear, fear of being hurt, misunderstood, smothered, or abandoned. So they push back, they withdraw, they reassert control by becoming emotionally unavailable, by choosing silence instead of vulnerability, detachment instead of confrontation. In doing so, they create the illusion that they are untouched, unaffected, and uninterested. But beneath that coldness is often a deep-rooted fear of being consumed or losing their emotional edge. What the avoidant often doesn't expect is the shift that happens when the other person, usually the empath, stops chasing, when the one who always reached out, always tried to understand, suddenly pulls away. The dynamic changes. The control they once had over the emotional rhythm of the relationship is disrupted, and that, more than anything else, is what causes panic. Avoidants are often comfortable in relationships where they feel emotionally superior, where they hold the power of distance. They subconsciously feel safer when the other person is doing the emotional work, but when the empath stops reaching out, when the apologies stop coming, when the reassurance is no longer offered, the avoidant is left without the emotional control they once had. And that's when fear shows up, not necessarily fear of losing love, but fear of losing the emotional high ground. It's easy to mistake this reaction for regret or renewed interest. Suddenly, they become more communicative. They ask how you are. They revisit memories. They even express a version of missing you. But it's important to see what's really happening. They're not mourning the loss of love. They're reacting to the absence of control. They don't miss being close. They miss being in charge of the closeness. What they really fear is the unpredictability that comes when someone else stops playing their emotional role. They're no longer sure of where they stand. They can no longer rely on the familiar cycle of pulling away and being pulled back. The empath, now silent and distant, becomes unfamiliar, unpredictable, and unpredictability to an avoidant is deeply unsettling. This is why many avoidants reappear after the empath detaches. It's not always because they're ready to love differently. It's often because they're uncomfortable with the shift in power. They feel the absence of attention, of validation, of emotional certainty. The space the empath used to fill is now empty, and they don't know how to navigate that space without control. They may reach out, but they rarely change. Because to truly shift, the avoidant has to confront their core fears, the fear of being known, the fear of needing someone, the fear of losing independence within connection. Until they're ready to do that deep inner work, their fear of losing control will always override their capacity to sustain real closeness. So when they panic, it isn't always about love lost, it's about no longer being able to manage the dynamic on their terms. And that loss of control, to them, feels like chaos. What they once avoided has now taken the form of silence, distance, and emotional self-possession from the empath. And in that reversal, they come face to face with the very thing they've tried to outrun, their fear of emotional vulnerability without control. Empaths are naturally wired to care. They feel deeply, they sense shifts in energy before anything is said aloud, and they're often the emotional anchors in their relationships. Their compassion is a gift. They can sit with someone in pain, make space for another's chaos, and offer understanding where others might respond with impatience or judgment. But that same gift becomes their greatest vulnerability when it's not balanced with boundaries. For much of their lives, empaths are taught, either directly or through experience, that love means giving, that connection means compromise, and that to maintain harmony, they must absorb the discomfort of others. They learn to overfunction in relationships, to overexplain themselves, to justify poor treatment because they can see the trauma behind the behavior. They convince themselves that if they just love harder, stay longer, or try more, the other person will eventually meet them with the same depth. What they don't always realize, at least not right away, is that being deeply loving doesn't mean they must also be endlessly available. Empaths often confuse open-heartedness with open access. They allow others to take from them emotionally without ever checking in with themselves. Am I okay here? Is this sustainable? Is this mutual? They stay when they feel unseen. They remain loyal even when they're emotionally starving. They listen when they need to be heard, but eventually something shifts. That shift is not sudden. It's a quiet build. After enough moments of feeling dismissed, enough cycles of being the one to hold everything together, enough nights spent overthinking in silence while the other person seems untouched, the empath begins to turn inward. They realize that they've been pouring from a cup that's been empty for far too long, and then they do something radical. They begin to set boundaries. For the empath, setting boundaries is not just a new behavior. It's a transformation. It's no longer explaining themselves to be understood by someone unwilling to listen. It's no longer saying yes to emotional labor that leaves them drained. It's saying, I love you, but I won't abandon myself for you. That's where their power begins to emerge. Boundaries don't harden the empath's heart. They protect it. They clarify where responsibility ends. They teach the empath to recognize the difference between empathy and self-sacrifice. They stop romanticizing potential and start requiring presence. And for someone who has lived most of their life giving freely without asking for much in return, that is an extraordinary evolution. Once an empath learns the strength of their no, their yes becomes even more meaningful. They no longer give out of guilt or fear of losing someone. They give because it feels aligned, mutual, and healthy. They start choosing themselves not as an act of selfishness, but as an act of survival. They no longer engage in emotional one-way streets. They no longer respond to manipulation disguised as affection. They see clearly who adds peace to their life and who only takes from it. And those who were once comfortable taking advantage of the empath's emotional availability begin to feel that shift too. The people who relied on their forgiveness, their silence, their unconditional patience, they begin to lose access. Not because the empath is punishing them, but because the empath is no longer available for relationships that require them to shrink. With boundaries, the empath becomes emotionally sovereign. They no longer seek validation in broken places. They no longer hand over their self-worth for temporary connection. They hold themselves with the same care they once reserved only for others. And in doing so, they attract a different kind of energy, one that respects, reciprocates, and rises to meet them where they are. The most powerful version of the empath is not the one who gives endlessly. It's the one who knows where to stop. It's the one who says, I love deeply, but I love wisely now. That is not the absence of empathy. It is empathy matured. Boundaries teach the empath that protecting their peace is not closing their heart. It's opening it in the right direction. There comes a moment when someone who has been caught in the cycle of emotional turmoil realizes they are no longer growing. They're just surviving. They're stuck, not because they don't know better, but because their heart is loyal to a pattern that feels familiar. This is especially true for empaths, those who are wired to nurture, to understand, to stay a little longer in the hope that their love might finally reach someone's guarded heart. But even the most patient soul eventually begins to feel the weight of repetition. And when that awareness settles in, a decision stands before them. Stay in the cycle that depletes them, or choose the unknown path of peace. Patterns are seductive. They feel like home even when they hurt. An empath might find themselves returning to the same kind of person, tolerating the same kind of behavior, replaying the same emotional dynamic, hoping this time it will change. The cycle might involve constant overgiving, walking on eggshells, decoding mixed signals, or holding space for someone who never shows up fully. These patterns are often reinforced by hope that things will get better, that the emotional distance will close, that love will be enough to fix what's broken. But patterns, when left unchallenged, become prisons. At first, the empath doesn't recognize this. They see their effort as love, their tolerance as compassion, their silence as patience. They tell themselves that understanding someone's pain means accepting their behavior. They stay not out of weakness, but out of commitment to the person, to the idea of the relationship, or even to their own identity as the one who always holds it together. And that commitment, while well-intentioned, slowly erodes their peace. Eventually, the exhaustion becomes undeniable. It shows up as anxiety that won't quiet down, as a nervous system stuck in a cycle of hypervigilance, as the slow realization that they feel more alone with someone than they do by themselves. And that's when the truth begins to rise. Love isn't meant to feel like emotional labor. It isn't meant to leave you doubting your worth. The bravest thing an empath can do is break the pattern, not with drama, not with resentment, but with a soft, steady refusal to continue betraying themselves. Choosing peace isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with a speech or a door slam. Often, it comes in the form of no longer reacting, no longer explaining, no longer engaging in the same emotional dance that leaves them feeling unseen and unheard. Choosing peace means stepping away from the need to fix, to prove, to fight for someone else's willingness to love you right. It means surrendering the story you told yourself, that your worth is something you have to earn through endurance. It means grieving not just the person, but the version of you that kept settling for less than you needed. This choice doesn't come easily. There are moments of doubt. There's guilt, fear, and the ache of detaching from something that once felt essential. But underneath it all, there's a quiet strength forming. Every time the empath chooses not to go back to what hurt them, that strength grows. Every time they honor their own needs without apology, they build trust within themselves. Peace isn't passive. It requires conscious effort to resist the emotional pull of what's familiar. It demands a new level of self-awareness and discipline. It asks you to feel the discomfort of not responding, of sitting in silence, of walking away when all you want is to stay. But in doing so, it offers something extraordinary: freedom. When the empath chooses peace over patterns, they begin to experience a different kind of life, one where their nervous system calms, where their days aren't defined by emotional roller coasters, where love feels safe and consistent. They no longer crave the highs and lows of toxic chemistry. They begin to understand that true connection doesn't come from chaos. It comes from emotional safety, mutual respect, and shared effort. and in choosing peace, they finally meet the version of themselves that's been waiting to breathe. Not the one surviving emotional storms, but the one thriving in stillness, the one who no longer sees love as a fight to win, but as a space where they are already enough. So if you've ever felt stuck in a cycle that looks like love, but feels like exhaustion, know that choosing peace isn't giving up. It's growing up. It's saying, I deserve more than emotional survival. I deserve to be met, not managed. And if this message spoke to something deep in you, if it reminded you of your strength, of your right to peace, and of the love you're truly worthy of, then don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to affirm your journey. Subscribe for more conversations that honor your healing and your growth, and share this with someone who's ready to break the pattern and find peace. Your story matters, your peace matters, and you're not alone anymore.